Hola, buenas tardes. Son las 4 de la tarde. Muchas gracias por estar presentes en este webinario. Mi nombre es Jorge Gironás, profesor del Departamento de Ingeniería Hidráulica y Ambiental de la Universidad Católica y director académico de la Cátedra de Sustentabilidad Hídrica Antofagasta Minerals. En el contexto de esta cátedra, hemos querido, aprovechando un poquito las posibilidades que nos ofrece la tecnología en esta pandemia, hemos querido contar con investigadores de alta reputación en el contexto internacional a través de estos webinars que hemos ido organizando. Este sería nuestro segundo webinar. Y en el día de hoy nos acompaña la doctora Wohl, doctora en geología y profesora de la Universidad Estatal de Colorado. La doctora Wohl recibió su licenciatura en geología en la Universidad Estatal de Arizona y tiene este doctorado en geociencias de la Universidad de Arizona. Se unió como miembro de la facultad en la Universidad Estatal de Colorado en 1989. Su investigación se centra en el estudio de corredores fluviales y ríos en general, con un foco importante en lo que es la interacción con las comunidades bióticas y humanas. Se ha enfocado particularmente en lo que son ríos de lecho rocoso y en regiones montañosas. Y su acción en términos de investigación es bastante sorprendente, siendo la Antártida el único continente donde no ha podido trabajar. Ella es miembro de la Unión Geofísica Americana y de la Sociedad Geológica de América, y gran parte de su investigación actual examina la complejidad física asociada a la presencia de vegetación, troncos e incluso la acción de los castores en los ecosistemas fluviales. La doctora Wohl es una geocientista reputada con fama internacional que también ha hecho mucho por la difusión de las ciencias geológicas y en particular de la geomorfología fluvial. Periódicamente publica algún libro de difusión en estos temas y su trabajo ha sido ampliamente reconocido. Por último, actualmente la doctora Wohl sirve como una de las editoras de Water Resources Research, que es la revista dedicada al agua más prestigiosa probablemente en el mundo. Hoy día, la doctora Wohl nos va a dar una charla que ella tituló en inglés, ¿no es cierto?, Messy Rivers and Healthy Rivers, The Role of a Spatial Heterogeneity in Sustaining River Ecosystems. Al igual que la vez pasada, el formato de la presentación o del webinar consiste en una exposición de nuestra invitada, que durará aproximadamente 45 minutos, y luego vamos a tener una sesión de preguntas y respuestas, que va a estar dirigida por dos profesores que trabajan justamente en sistemas fluviales. Nos acompaña la doctora Isabel Rojas de la Facultad de Agronomía e Ingeniería Forestal, y el doctor Cristian Escauriaza de la Facultad de Ingeniería. Los voy a presentar un poquito más en extenso cuando llegue el momento. Finalmente, después de una media hora, vamos a dar por cerrado el webinar. Ustedes pueden hacer sus preguntas a través de la página, ¿no es cierto?, aquí en YouTube. Los comentarios que ustedes escriban son recibidos por nuestros profesores y así entonces podremos establecer esta conversación. Now I'm going to switch to English. Ellen, I just gave a brief introduction. I presented you and your work. We're very, very happy that you are joining us today. These webinars are very important for us because they allow us to be in touch with the international community. So we're very glad that you're here with us. And that's it. So please go ahead. Thank you again and enjoy.
Thank you. Let me see if I can get myself, sorry, I'm trying to share my screen. I'm trying to figure out how to go back to share screen. Let me stop for a minute and then start over as share screen. Okay, are you seeing my title slide now? Sorry, can someone tell me, can you see my title slide and hear me?
See it, Ellen?
Can you can see it? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, Jorge. As Jorge mentioned, I'm going to talk about messy rivers. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about, I'm going to explain that. But basically, if you think about an irrigation canal, it's a simple, straight, uniform channel. It's as uniform as it can be made. And the idea is just to convey water down the canal efficiently. Natural rivers, to the degree that they deviate from something that's completely uniform and homogeneous, are messy, or they have spatial heterogeneity. And I've got two examples showing here. The upper photo is an area that has been extensively modified by beavers, and the lower photo, you can see a couple of large log jams in the channel. So just by way of background of thinking about spatial heterogeneity in rivers, here's a nice example of the Yukon River in central Alaska. It is not a straight, simple, single channel. There are a couple things that I think it's important to talk about before we start discussing the details of spatial heterogeneity. The first is how we all perceive rivers. And social scientists refer to something called the shifting baseline of perception. This is just the idea that whatever you are personally used to becomes normal for you. So, for example, if you've grown up in the middle of a big city where every river is essentially a concrete canal, that may be what you think of as normal for a river. The other component of shifting baseline is that if there's very gradual change through time, people don't really notice. So if you were looking at a river flowing through a forested region, and maybe historically it had a lot of log jams in it, for example, if there was deforestation in the catchment and wood was removed from the channel, say for flood control or navigation, if it was a large enough channel, you might not be aware of the progressive loss of those log jams. So again, it's whatever you are personally used to as normal and what you expect to see. The second component of this background is that there's no consistent level of spatial heterogeneity that is appropriate for all rivers. I've got a picture of a very large river in the Arctic zone on the screen here, the Yukon River in Alaska. That is going to have different sources and different forms of spatial heterogeneity than a river that's flowing through, say, an alluvial basin below a mountain range in any part of Chile, certainly northwestern Chile in the desert. So the environmental context of where you are in the world governs the details of spatial heterogeneity natural. And the third, the hardest one to answer, is what is natural? In the Americas, we often take it as prior to European colonization, because of course the Europeans brought industrial scale agriculture, deforestation, sand and gravel mining in river corridors, a lot of activities. There are, of course, indigenous communities that altered rivers substantially in prehistory, but mostly it's post-European settlement. So you can set a time frame, but it still can be very difficult to determine what is natural if every river in a region has been extensively modified. What do you use for a reference condition? So that's a big challenge. But looking at the shifting baseline of perception a little bit more, this is the inside front cover of a textbook. As it says, the title is River Pollution, and it was written by an English author from the British Isles. So you see this drawing and you say, yeah, that's a polluted river. It's in pretty bad shape. The opposing inside front cover had this drawing, which I found really interesting. It looks much nicer, and that's a very pastoral scene, a boy and his dog fishing. But the more I looked at that, the more I thought, I don't actually think that's a very good illustration of a really natural river corridor in England, because historically, everything in the British Isles was forested. There weren't any big meadows or grasslands. It was all forest cover. And so this is already showing a river that's been modified quite a lot. But I think most people would look at this drawing on the left and say, not only is that better than the drawing on the right, but it's an ideal of what you might want to strive for in restoration or management. And that gets back to the idea that many of us have had our baselines shifted, our baseline of perception, either as a society or as individuals. I was recently involved in a group that wrote the paper that I'm referencing here just last year, where we talked about how historically what we called multi-channel rivers or river wetland corridors were far more common around the world. That you can still find many of them in lower latitudes or in very high latitudes, but in the temperate zone, a lot of them have been channelized and they've been changed to a single channel that is often much simpler. So now when people undertake river restoration, they don't think of trying to go back to something like these systems. It would be a river wetland corridor with secondary channels and extensive floodplain wetlands. So what you consider normal also strongly influences what you're managing towards or what you're trying to restore. That environmental context, again, where you are in the world makes a difference. So the photo on the left is the Arctic tundra in Alaska. The photo on the right is subtropical, seasonal subtropics in Australia. Again, different sources and forms of spatial heterogeneity. And then what is natural? You can ask or explore a whole series of concepts. You start with the fact that natural systems, of course, are not static. They're dynamic through time and space. So whatever parameter you choose to look at, it could be the community structure of the riparian vegetation or the bedload transport. There's going to be a natural range of variability. There will be variability through space and time. If our systems that we're looking at have been heavily altered, maybe we try to find the least altered systems and understand reference conditions. Regardless, I think it's very important to understand land use history and what humans have done in the past. And that might sound obvious, but in many cases, these could be historic land uses that haven't been occurring for a century, but they still have a continuing effect on the river form and function. And part of understanding how land use history might have changed things is understanding the natural regimes of water and sediment in the river. Again, depending on where you are in the world and where you are in a catchment, maybe it's a site that would naturally have repeated debris flows and large sediment inputs if you're in a very mountainous environment. Or maybe it's a place that would have only very gradual sediment introduction through bank erosion along the channel. But the point is that the details matter of where you are in the world. So I think of river corridor, and I use the phrase river corridor to refer to the active channel, the floodplain, and the underlying hypereic zone. And if you're not familiar with that term hypereic zone, it refers to the flow paths of water that originate in the channel, go into the shallow subsurface, and then return to the channel. So it differs from groundwater in that the flow paths originate and terminate in the surface channel. And I think of a reach as a length of river corridor that has consistent geometry. So if you're on a very small headwater channel, a reach could be 10 meters or 30 meters in length. If you're on the Amazon, a reach might be tens of kilometers on length. The scale would vary with the size of the river you're looking at. But when I think about a reach scale, I think first of fluxes moving through that river corridor. So water, sediment in all rivers. In forested river corridors, large wood was historically a very important flux. Those fluxes interact with what I've called context here. So it would be the valley geometry at the reach scale. Things like, are you in the headwaters or are you in a lowland alluvial basin? Spatial limits here refers to the lateral limits for channel migration. The little inset photo on the left is a bottom of a deep, narrow bedrock canyon. There's very little room for the river to move laterally. The photo on the right, that's a very low gradient alluvial surface. The river can meander broadly. So it's got different spatial limits. That photo on the left, the boundary erosional resistance of the floodplain would be very high because it's bedrock. And again, the photo on the right, it would be much less because it's alluvium. And how stable the base level is will also strongly influence valley geometry. And I put human influence in here because we typically don't change valley geometry, but we do change how the river interacts with that valley geometry. Think about flow regulation or artificial levees that maybe limit overbank flow, or bank stabilization that limits the meander wavelength or amplitude. So we do influence those interactions in that context. But the fluxes moving through this context then result in a whole series of characteristics, and I've listed just a few here in that first row of spatial heterogeneity, basically how non-uniform is the river corridor. Connectivity, you can think of this in 3 dimensions. There's longitudinal connectivity going downstream, lateral connectivity between the channel and floodplain, and vertical connectivity between the surface and subsurface. And these apply to water, sediment, solids, organic matter. Resilience is basically how does the river corridor respond to a disturbance, such as a flood or a debris flow or a drought. And the last 2 terms, they're geomorphic and ecological integrity, are essentially how close the river corridor is or how far it is from what you might think of as natural, non-human altered conditions. And I'm guessing that most of you have heard the term ecological integrity, but geomorphic integrity may be a little more unfamiliar to you. And the idea there is that if you have a river corridor that has geomorphic integrity, it has the freedom to adjust to disturbances. So a large flood comes along, the water goes over bank, maybe the channel widens, the channel moves laterally. If you lack geomorphic integrity, a large flood could be going down an urban system that's completely stabilized by concrete. So the water just gets faster and deeper. There's no change in river corridor form in response to that input. And then the second level, the yellow text, are just examples of some of these parameters. If you wanted to look at spatial heterogeneity, you could look at downstream variations in gradient, as you see at the left there. Is it a uniform gradient, or do you have waterfalls and lower gradient reaches? And again, all of this is occurring in that river corridor context, so the channel, floodplain, and hyporheic zone. And this is a three-dimensional illustration of the river corridor that comes from a nice paper that was published a few years ago called River Corridor Science. It looks busy. The individual arrows are distinguishing discrete flow paths for water and solids. But the thing to take from it is that, of course, water and the material dissolved in it does not just move simply and straightforwardly downstream. There are a lot of lateral and vertical exchanges en route, so it is a very three-dimensional system. And if you neglect that, you're missing a lot of the details that matter in terms of habitat and nutrients for organisms, water chemistry, sediment storage, flood attenuation, or flood or water storage during periods of low flow. So the three-dimensional nature really matters. And I think it's important to conceptualize rivers as river corridors. If you just say river, most people think of the active channel, and that's it. If you say river corridors, it at least implies there's more to it than just a channel. So it can really help to emphasize some of these interactions between physical process and form, like do you have a braided river or a meandering river, between the biogeochemical reactions associated with the three-dimensional connectivity and the biota, both plants and animals in the river corridor. It can also really emphasize those interactions between the three basic components of the river corridor: the channel, the floodplain, and the hyporheic zone. Okay, so how do you describe spatial heterogeneity in a river corridor? Well, there can be heterogeneity of the stream bed. So as you go downstream, it's not a uniform elevation. It's not a uniform grain size. You can have bed forms, variation in grain size. Again, in the forested region, you may have things like log jams that are facilitating some of this variation. So this photo is looking downstream in a small channel in Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. Most of the channel is much steeper and has boulder-sized material, but here the logjam has created an obstruction and a backwater, so you have finer sediment and organic material being stored and a lower gradient reach in that backwater zone. You can also have heterogeneity in the banks. This could be large scale, like meander bends. This is just a small scale example. It's a subalpine channel in a meadow, and on the left bank, the flow is going away from the front here. On the left bank, you can see there are these small undulations in the bank. You can have bank irregularities associated with trees, with other vegetation, with large boulders, with bedrock. But if it's not a straight uniform bank, you've got flow separation in each of those little indentations or embayments. So you're going to have different velocity and depth, maybe water temperature. You're probably going to have a difference in the hyporheic exchange between the surface and subsurface. You're likely to have some of these transient storage of finer sediment and organic matter. So even these small-scale heterogeneities change the processes on the local scale. You can also, of course, have heterogeneity in the plan form of the river. In the cross-sectional form, you may have pools and riffles or bends and straight reaches. And then the plan form, you can look at heterogeneity across the river corridor. So both the active channel, but also the floodplain. And for the active channel, things like the degree of sinuosity, the number of channels, if there's secondary channels like a braiding plan form or anastomosing. So I think of these as the four basic dimensions in which spatial heterogeneity can be characterized. What causes it? Why do you not have a uniform channel in most natural channels? Well, there are geologic controls, and this may be a change in rock type, or it could also just be something like a change in the joints, the small fractures in the bedrock, or the structure of the bedrock, like folds and faults. But those geologic controls create differences in weathering and erodibility and erosional resistance of the valley that are expressed through valley geometry. You can also certainly have vegetation, whether it's non-woody wetland vegetation like sedges and rushes, grasses, or woody riparian forests that create spatial heterogeneity. And certainly the fact that the fluxes of water, sediment, and large wood moving through the river corridor are not constant in time and space, that also creates heterogeneity. So for example, there's a debris flow somewhere in the headwaters and a large amount of sediment comes through the system, and maybe it increases the rate of meander migration. So you've got heterogeneity that's a function of lateral channel movement because of the change in sediment flux. So fundamentally, geologic controls, vegetation, and those fluxes create patterns of sediment erosion and deposition. And again, these would change through time and space in natural river corridors. But the changes in erosion and deposition then create sideways movement of the channel or avulsion, or they create downstream changes in bed forms or substrate. So it's very much a feedback in terms of what I've been talking about with forms of spatial heterogeneity and sources of spatial heterogeneity. Okay, so why do we even care about any of this? What does it matter if a river is not uniform and if it's got this variation through time and space? Well, a big one, certainly in much of river management, is providing habitat. Different types of habitat and abundant habitat for a wide range of organisms. And we're used to thinking in many cases about things like plants and fish, but if you have a spatially heterogeneous river corridor like I'm showing here, you've also got diversity of grain size and soil moisture and water residence time or hydrologic residence time moving through this river corridor. So that's going to translate to differences in microbial communities. And the microbial communities, for example, influence nitrate and denitrification, so nitrate content in the river. So just an example of, there's an abandoned floodplain wetland that's gradually filling in. There's one that's got a lot more open water. There's the main channel. There's secondary channels. This particular river in interior Alaska has no flow regulation, no timber harvest, no anything that, most of the things that people do. So it's a very, very spatially heterogeneous system, and it has a lot of habitat and very diverse habitat. And I should say that habitat by itself is not enough to support biodiversity, but it is a key precursor. It's a very important part of maintaining biodiversity and biomass. A second implication is how the river corridor responds to disturbance. And these could be natural disturbances like wildfire, flood, or drought, or they could be human-induced disturbances, ongoing climate change, or specific resource uses like sand and gravel aggregate mining, or use of channelization of the river corridor for navigation. So an example here from a site that's close to where I live, this is the same area that I showed in the title slide. It's a meadow that's been modified by beaver, and I know beaver have a bad reputation in Chile and Argentina, and I've heard Chileans and Argentinians argue about who introduced them and who's responsible for all the damage they're doing in Tierra del Fuego in the very far south. But in North America, in the Northern Hemisphere, beaver are native, and they're a very important part of river ecosystems. They, of course, build dams and dig canals. And one of the secondary effects of that is that you end up with what's sometimes called a beaver meadow that you see in the upper photo here. There's multiple channels that branch and rejoin. There's abandoned beaver ponds in various stages of infilling. There's a very high riparian water table that supports very dense willow or different species of salix, which is what you see in the lower photo when they're just leafing out in spring. So this is an extremely resilient portion of the river corridor. If there's a fire or a drought, there's a lot of surface water and a high riparian water table. That portion of the river corridor, the valley floor, won't burn, and it won't dry out nearly as quickly as a single, simple, uniform channel would. It's also very resilient to flood. If you look at that ground photo, it's hard to tell in there, but there are actually 3 secondary channels coming together. But what you definitely see is the very dense riparian vegetation. We actually had an extremely large flood here in 2013, and when I came up to the site to look at how things looked after the flood, I couldn't even tell there had been a flood. The floodwater, the energy of the floodwaters was dissipated so effectively by this broad valley floor and dense vegetation and areas of secondary flow and standing water that there was minimal erosion. There was deposition at the upstream end of this portion of the river corridor, but not much anywhere downstream. So In general, the more spatially heterogeneous the river corridor, the more resilient or able to absorb disturbances it is to a variety of disturbances. Another illustration of that, this is also a beaver modified corridor. This is in Idaho. My colleague Joe Wheaton at Utah State took this photo a few years ago. The adjacent hill slopes here are completely burned. This was a very intense wildfire, but the valley bottom, particularly in the middle portion of the view here, where there's been a lot of beaver dams and beaver ponds, again, it was very resilient to the fire, so it didn't burn. A third implication is just retention of material moving downstream, whether it's surface water, subsurface water, solutes, particulate matter like sediment or organic matter. Again, if you think about an irrigation canal, it's straight and it's uniform. It's designed for maximum conveyance, just move material downstream efficiently. A natural channel with all this heterogeneity, secondary channels, obstructions like log jams or beaver dams, variations in cross-sectional geometry, secondary channels, cutoff meanders, floodplain wetlands, there's a lot of storage space in there. There's a lot of places where water can separate from the main downstream direction, can move into the subsurface. And of course, if you have flow separation or subsurface flow, the velocity declines. Any of the material that water is carrying is more likely to be deposited. This photo that I'm showing you here, the flow is from right to left. It's a very small channel. It's about 2 meters wide. You could jump across it pretty easily. Most of this channel is extraordinarily steep. It's half-meter to meter diameter boulders in steps and pools. There's a small logjam that formed here, created a small backwater. It's trapping the sand and silt that would normally keep going downstream, as well as organic matter. Now, this logjam probably blew out the next snowmelt peak flow after I took this photo in summer. It doesn't have to be persistent. It can be fairly transient on timescales of years or a few years, because biologists have shown that the microbial communities in what's called a biofilm, which is essentially a microbial community of algae, bacteria, fungi living in a substrate on rivers, if those organisms can get access to coarse particulate organic matter, like the bits of leaves and twigs that you see here, even for a few hours, that dramatically increases the biological uptake. So you're processing nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, or you're biologically assimilating carbon. You're, instead of just flushing everything downstream, you're retaining it. And of course, if you're talking about a big floodplain river, then you can have sediment storage in the floodplain for literally thousands of years. So wherever it's being stored and for however long, the more spatially heterogeneous the river corridor, the more retention you have. A fourth implication would be that spatial heterogeneity influences connectivity. It may increase it or decrease it, but it does play a role in changing connectivity. In the photo that I'm showing you here, this is on the west side of Rocky Mountain National Park, and the little, what looks like a little pile of sticks in the lower right is an abandoned beaver lodge. There's no beaver dams here now, but when the beaver were here and there was a dam, that dam would have dramatically decreased longitudinal connectivity, or upstream, downstream, but it would have increased lateral connectivity by creating an obstruction. So it would have increased connectivity between the floodplain and the channel, and the obstruction would have also created pressure gradients that would increase vertical connectivity by forcing hypereic flow into the bed underneath the logjam. So again, heterogeneity influences connectivity. It can decrease or increase it, but it does influence connectivity, and connectivity is very closely tied to some of the other things I've been talking about, like retention and resilience. Okay, so back in 1969, my predecessor here at Colorado State University was Stanley Shum, and he introduced the term river metamorphosis to refer to a complete change of river form and process. And he was talking about that in the context of flow regulation for rivers on the shortgrass steppe in eastern Colorado. But the context I'm using it here, it's a change from a more heterogeneous river corridor to a more homogeneous river corridor. And there are lots of different things that can drive that. If you change those fluxes, say you change water fluxes by regulating the flow, or you change sediment fluxes by storing a lot of sediment in a reservoir behind a human-built dam, you can make the river corridor more homogeneous. So basically, if you have a heterogeneous versus a homogeneous corridor, it's driven by either the presence or the absence of those variations in fluxes that I call inputs here, and also biota. So if you take all the large wood out, you remove the beaver, you change the riparian vegetation, that's probably going to change the spatial heterogeneity of the river. The degree to which it's heterogeneous or homogeneous is also driven by the level of geomorphic integrity. Again, integrity implies the ability to adjust the river corridor form to variations in inputs. So if you have a large flood, there will be erosion and deposition. If you have low geomorphic integrity, you have a large flood and there's not much change. And one way that I think of this is that rivers tend to become leaky as they become more homogeneous. So leaky here means everything gets passed downstream more efficiently. They become more like irrigation canals with maximum conveyance. If you straighten the channel, if you stabilize the banks, if you remove any obstructions or dredge it to get rid of shallow points, you're losing a lot of that flow separation, the potential for nutrients to be taken up by riparian and aquatic biota. So you're leaking nutrients, you're leaking sediment downstream and losing that retention. And most of the examples that I'm talking about are from fairly small headwater mountain streams in Colorado, because that's where I've done a lot of my work. But this applies to the largest rivers, not the largest. The Amazon is still in pretty good shape, as is the Congo, but many large rivers in the temperate zone have been dramatically altered. So they've undergone river metamorphosis. So the upper pair of photos here is the Rhine River in Central Europe. It's a historic painting on the left, and this is what the photo on the right is what the Rhine looks like now. It always makes me think of a highway with two sets of parallel lanes. The Danube River near Linz, Austria, it's a large city in the middle of Austria. If you look at the lower left, the drawing is from 1812. You see, again, a channel with many secondary channels. There would be a lot of floodplain wetlands and a very diverse habitat and biota across that river corridor. And by 1991, you can still see some of the secondary channels, but they're mostly not active. They're just ponded water, and it's been dramatically simplified and straightened to a single channel. And this has been undertaken mostly for navigation and for flood control. Both the Rhine and the Danube are extensively used for barge traffic, for hydroelectric power generation, and of course the floodplains are used for cities and agriculture now. Okay, so if you lose heterogeneity, the point I want to make is that you lose what you could think of as river health. You lose many of those functions I was talking about earlier. So evidence that messy equals healthy. These are just a few examples. Of course, everyone, or many people around the world, are very concerned about the amount of carbon that's going into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide and further enhancing climate warming. So we'd like to be able to sequester carbon in various places, and people have looked at reforestation, for example, storing carbon in living forests. And most of the terrestrial carbon globally is stored in soils. A lot of that is in the very high latitudes where you have permafrost or permanently frozen soil that's very organic rich. But when you look at river networks in the temperate latitudes, what you see is that there's a lot more carbon stored in valley floor or floodplain soils than there are in adjacent uplands. So this very brief summary here is based on Nick Sutphin's PhD work that he finished a few years ago. We looked at mountain stream networks in the Southern Rockies in Colorado, and we found two things. First of all, that if you sort of spread the fingers of your hand and think of that as a river network, not all of the length of every finger is equal in terms of storing carbon. The wider, lower gradient portions of the river network both have more surface area, and they also tend to have greater lateral connectivity and vertical connectivity. So they often have very high riparian water tables. And if you have saturated soils, you've got reducing conditions. So any organic matter added to that soil is less likely to be decomposed by microbes and released as CO2 to the atmosphere. So basically those, what I call here unconfined, they're laterally unconfined. So again, wide, low gradient valley bottoms, they're less than a quarter of the total river length, but they store 3/4 of the carbon that we estimate is present in the entire river network. And that's almost a quarter of the total carbon in the entire watershed, even though the river network itself is less than 1% of the landscape. So it's really just emphasizing the point that the valley floors store a lot of carbon in the form of soil organic carbon. And limited portions of that valley floor are disproportionately important. They store even more carbon, those wide, low gradient, typically saturated zones that have a lot of floodplain wetlands. Another iteration of that, this was Deanna Laurel's PhD work, the Beaver Meadows, those areas that are extensively modified by beavers. They have very high lateral and vertical connectivity, limited longitudinal connectivity, and again, they store a large amount of carbon relative to their area in the landscape. And if the beavers are removed, their dams fall into disrepair, the riparian soils start to dry out, and you go to oxidizing conditions. So you do release some carbon into the atmosphere as CO2, but there's still more carbon stored in those valley floor soils than there are in adjacent upland soils. Another thing to look at, what is being retained in the active channel? What are the rates of denitrification through those microbial communities in the hyporheic zone, and just how much biomass is there? And this was Bridget Leiber's PhD. She did the geomorphic portion of it. We had collaborators who looked at denitrification and biomass. And what we found is that if you have old growth forest, you have more wood and larger pieces of wood coming into the stream. Those create more log jams that are stable and persistent. So you get this greater spatial heterogeneity and a lot of backwater storage associated with those log jams. And of course, the log jams themselves are 50% organic carbon, and then they're storing organic material that's 50% carbon in the backwaters. They're also driving hyporheic exchange because of that pressure gradient around the log jam, so you have more denitrification or nutrient uptake. And we found that there's a greater biomass and a greater biodiversity of aquatic insect predators. So salmonid fish and riparian spiders were the two categories of predators that our colleagues in this study looked at. There's more production of aquatic insects, but they get eaten very effectively by these aquatic and riparian predators. Another line of evidence, just how long water stays in the river corridor. And this one I think is kind of common sense. If you have a more spatially heterogeneous river corridor, you've got more diverse flow paths. So you'll have some water moving downstream in the main channel, some in secondary channels, some in the subsurface in preferential flow paths, others moving through diffuse matrix flow. So you end up with a wider distribution of hydrologic residence times. Some of those are quite slow. And again, that provides opportunities for microbial uptake of some of the solutes like nitrate or nitrogen that's in this water. And this was based on modeling that some colleagues did at a site in Montana. And that same site in Montana, Alison Appling coined this phrase that I like a lot, the floodplain biogeochemical mosaic. And as you can see, the leftmost map here is the soil carbon storage. It's spatially heterogeneous. And then the right map is potential denitrification or removal of nitrate from the water. And I'm not sure what the situation is in Chile, but certainly in the United States and much of the northern hemisphere, excess nitrate is a very major concern. It's a major pollutant in systems, and anything you can do to increase denitrification is good. So in this case, having this spatially heterogeneous river corridor creates at least some areas that are sinks for carbon and hotspots for removal of nitrate. Okay, so globally, I've been talking mostly about smaller mountain streams in the Southern Rockies, but everything I've said applies to rivers of any size in much of the world, certainly the industrialized regions or the temperate latitudes. Globally, we know we as humans have almost completely eliminated old growth forest. Certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, different parts like Europe, we have centuries of deliberately and actively removing wood from river corridors. When Europeans came to the United States and North America, they started doing that very intensively. So during the 18th and 19th and continuing into the 20th and 21st centuries, there's a lot of wood removal. So we're taking out that heterogeneity, both the heterogeneity produced by the presence of the wood and then the secondary heterogeneity of things like backwater storage associated with the wood. As humans, we've also reduced forest cover by half relative to pre-industrial conditions and, again, nearly eliminated old growth. So ecologists sometimes talk about alternative states, and it's the idea that you can look at an ecosystem and it can have two very different configurations, and both of those can be stable as long as nothing disturbs the ecosystem and changes its configuration. And I think we could think of alternative states for rivers as well. You could have a very simple homogeneous river, or you could have a very spatial heterogeneous river. And in the context of large wood, I've used these very technical terms of wood rich and wood poor. So the photo on the left, that's a big log jam in Rocky Mountain National Park. We know that the amount of wood entering these mountain streams varies through time and space. Sometimes there's a wildfire or a blowdown. Other years, very little wood comes in. But as long as there's some wood in the channel, it's effective at trapping new wood. So even if there are periods when there's no wood entering the channel, you can have a lot of wood storage, and it's a very stable and persistent configuration. The photo on the right here that I've labeled wood poor, if you take all the wood out, even if you stop removing wood and you let the forest regrow, it's hard to get back to a wood-rich state. If you look at this tree that's leaning over the channel, sort of midway up this view, if that tree falls in, it's not a very big tree. There's nothing to trap it. That's a pretty straight, uniform channel. It doesn't have obstructions like previously stored wood. So the tree's probably going to keep moving downstream. Both space for time substitution, so looking at forests with different management histories, and numerical models from places as diverse as the Western US, New Zealand, Australia, and Western Europe, suggests that it takes something like 200 years to go back to a wood-rich state if you deforest an area and artificially remove all the wood. It's a long recovery time. So you could think of, on a timescale of a century or more, these alternative states are both very stable and persistent. And you can have different configurations of the river corridor based on the amount of wood. Beaver, I know it's not very applicable to the southern hemisphere, but certainly they were far more abundant historically in the northern hemisphere. I've got the numbers for North America here. They're comparable for Europe. Ecologists have written quite a bit about the alternative states of what are called beaver meadows and elk grasslands. So the photo on the left, when the beaver are present, building dams, you have all the effects I talked about earlier. A multi-channel planform, lots of ponded water. The dams can become inactive, the ponds can become inactive and gradually fill in, but they can persist for decades to more than a century. So you have a certain river corridor configuration. If the beaver are removed for whatever reason, the dams fall into disrepair. The flow is more likely to be concentrated in a single channel rather than spread into multiple subparallel channels. If you concentrate the flow, you've got more energy exerted against the channel boundaries. The channel often widens and incisors, and as the channel incisors or cuts down, it lowers the riparian water table to the point that willows, which are what are known as obligate phreatophytes, they depend on their roots being able to reach the water table, they may no longer be able to survive. And in many parts of the western US, the beaver have disappeared for a variety of reasons, but they, in some cases, have been outcompeted by large ungulates. So elk and moose also like to eat willows, but they will eat them down to the ground, and basically they're natural deforestation machines or animals if they don't have natural predators. The predators that would normally keep them moving and prevent that type of change in the riparian vegetation were hunted to extinction early in the 20th century, and they're being reintroduced now. Places like Yellowstone National Park are a famous example. But if the predators aren't present, the elk and moose will completely destroy the woody riparian vegetation. You end up with the grasses that you see here and a much drier, simpler, more homogeneous river corridor. And that can persist for a long period of time. And if you dropped off a pair of happily mated beavers here and said, build a dam and be fruitful and multiply, they probably won't be able to survive. They need woody plants to get through the winter. It's very hard for them to build a dam in a channel that's as deep and narrow as this. It's hard to get a sense of scale here, but that channel from the water surface to the top of the bank is almost 2 meters. So once you've gone into this alternative stable state, it's very hard to get back to something like beaver meadows. And of course, there are lots of other things that we as humans have done. Global flow regulation in the form of dams gets the majority of the attention. We don't know as much about how much flow is diverted or how many rivers are channelized or what the extent is of artificial levees, but certainly all of these alterations have had the cumulative effect of making rivers less heterogeneous. And as I say at the top of this slide, if you just look at dams, there's less than a quarter of the rivers globally that still flow uninterrupted to the ocean. So these effects are extensive. around the world. So how spatially heterogeneous should it be? How messy should your river corridor be? Well, it depends on where you are in a catchment and in the world. So it depends on the environmental context. It also really depends on land use history. Maybe your particular catchment was extremely spatially heterogeneous prior to intensive resource use. But maybe you can't go back to that level of heterogeneity because there are a few million people living in Santiago and using water and living right next to the river and having to stabilize the banks. I don't think heterogeneity is an either or, it's a continuum. So if you have a catchment that has been highly altered and a river corridor that's been highly altered, it may not be feasible to go back to pristine or completely natural conditions. But if you restore some level of heterogeneity, you may be able to regain some of the lost function and some of the lost environmental benefits. So just 3 pictures chosen kind of randomly from rivers around the world: an ephemeral river in Sardinia, a canyon, a very small headwater stream in the tropics of Borneo, and then a moderate-sized stream in the southern Rockies. They all have different fluxes, different context at the reach scale, different sources and forms of heterogeneity, but they are all heterogeneous. They're not simple like irrigation canals. So another way to think of this is a nice diagram that was developed by David Knighton, a British geomorphologist, a couple of decades ago, and he was really thinking about how different components of a river network and river corridor respond. So if you look at the lower left corner, dunes and ripples in a sand bed channel, they changed almost instantaneously over very small spatial scales. As you go towards the upper right in this diagram, you're getting to features that are really influenced by climatic and geologic regimes. So they're large spatial scales, long time scale adjustment. The short to intermediate is mostly what we as humans have altered, either deliberately through river engineering or inadvertently through land use, say through changing upland cover or nutrient loads coming in, say from agricultural and urban areas. And the net effects of those modifications have been to make our rivers much more homogeneous. We've deliberately or inadvertently reduced spatial heterogeneity, again, usually because we want to get things downstream fast, whether the thing is a barge that's carrying materials or a flood that we don't want to spread into the floodplain or areas adjacent to the active channel. So we've undertaken a wide variety of activities that have reduced spatial heterogeneity. Now, as part of river restoration, people are trying to think about how to restore spatial heterogeneity, and there's a lot of questions around that. One of them is, how much spatial heterogeneity do you need to restore? I mentioned nitrate is a major pollutant. Let's say your whole catchment is, or the majority of it is agricultural and urban land cover, and you have a big nitrate pollution problem. Well, how much of the river corridor do you need to restore? And how much denitrification do you need to restore? 10%? 50%? 80%? We don't know. So I think in order to be able to predict some of these desired outcomes, we are going to have to continue to collect basic field data, but we have to integrate that with numerical modeling that includes thresholds and is verified or calibrated based on field experiments, often river restoration with monitoring. So when I think about what's happened over the last 2 decades, we've made enormous strides as a river science community in understanding 2-dimensional hydraulic and sediment transport. When I started as a graduate student, we used only 1D models, and they were mostly hydraulics. They hadn't been coupled with sediment transport. Now it's routine to use 2D models with sediment. Now we need to add things like large wood, the interactions between boundary erosional resistance and roughness as governed by riparian vegetation, and basically use those coupled integrative models to try and understand and predict different components of river corridor spatial heterogeneity and some of the processes that are associated with that, like those 3-dimensional fluxes or particular response variables that might be of most interest, such as organic carbon stock, or how much carbon is stored in floodplain soils, or how much denitrification occurs per unit length, say per kilometer of valley, or how much biomass can we support in fish or in riparian vegetation or whatever is of interest. So when I come back to this photo that you've seen before, I hope that when you look at a river corridor, you'll think about those 3-dimensional fluxes. You'll think about some of the products of those three-dimensional fluxes in the spatial heterogeneity, and I've just listed a few here, like organic carbon stocks. And you'll think about all of this occurring in a river corridor, not just in an active channel. So coming back to those pair of drawings we looked at the beginning, I asked one of our grad students, who's a good artist, to re-envision that drawing on the left. And I'm not sure what happened to the dog, but the boy is catching a fish now. If you start to look at some of the details here, he's sitting on a log. So there's a riparian forest. There's a little bit of age diversity indicated by the green blob here. There's the down large wood. There's not just a uniform vertical bank. There's a what's called a varial zone by ecologists, an area that's alternately wetted and dried and provides important habitat for small organisms during high flows. There's evidence of channel migration. There's a little cutoff there across the point bar. There's evidence of pools and riffles. So there's more diversity and more spatial heterogeneity in the different forms that we've been talking about. And I think this would be more representative of an English or a British stream prior to industrialization and intensive land use. I think that because I'm a river scientist and I've looked at a lot of rivers in minimally human-altered environments, but most people in England would not think of this as an ideal scenario for their rivers. So again, it comes back to that perception, and perception is key, not least because whatever we as scientists or engineers do is done in a societal context, and people will not accept or push for river restoration to this type of river corridor if they don't understand or think about the fact that this is what might be the most natural configuration of what might have been present historically. And there are some nice papers that talk about how societal perceptions influence river management and restoration. And as an example of this, this is a site in the Dolomites in Italy. The photo on the left from 2005, you can see each of those white lines across the channel is a check dam or a grade control structure. The bank was heavily stabilized, and you can see there's been a lot of land use encroachment on the historic floodplain. So there's a small community back here. There are agricultural and recreational fields. The European Union proposed a river restoration project here to make this more like a braided channel, which is what would have been present historically. It would be the natural channel configuration in this particular part of the drainage basin. There was a lot of public resistance to this. People did not want to see a braided channel, but the project went ahead. They removed most of the grade control structures. They removed some of the bank stabilization. And they haven't restored the entire river corridor here. The floodplain still has the community and some of the other land uses, but they do have a portion of the river that's now braided and laterally adjustable and mobile. And this photo was taken in 2010. I had a chance to visit the site in 2018, and many of these braid bars are becoming colonized by riparian vegetation. So there are successional vegetation communities. There's a lot more riparian biodiversity. And I was there in November in the Northern Hemisphere, late autumn, and it was not a very nice day. It was really cold, and it was sort of drizzling or sleeting, almost snowing. But there were so many people out enjoying this river corridor. There were people watching birds, they were fishing, they were walking their dogs, they were rollerblading. And now this project won a prize, this river restoration project, from the European Union Water Framework Directive, and the local community is very proud of what the river looks like now. So there's been this complete change in how local people perceive the river corridor. So even if most people aren't used to thinking of braided rivers as an attractive or desirable river form, attitudes can change with education and with outreach by river scientists. So with there, I will end it, and I am happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. Nice talk, nice topic. I'm sure that, well, there are some comments already, so I'm sure that people have a lot of questions and thoughts about the topic. So we're moving now to the question and answer session. I'm gonna switch to English, to Spanish, sorry, to present our colleagues here. Bueno, como le comentaba la profesora Wohl, muy interesante su charla. Ya vemos que hay ciertos comentarios, ciertas preguntas, entonces vamos a pasar a la sesión de preguntas y respuestas, que va a estar dirigida por la profesora Isabel Rojas y el profesor Cristian Escauriaza. La profesora Rojas es ingeniera forestal de la Universidad Católica y estudió su máster en la Universidad de Wisconsin en Ecología del Paisaje aplicada a la conservación y también su doctorado en la Universidad de Wisconsin en especies invasivas y la conservación de humedales urbanos. Además, la doctora Rojas hizo un postdoc en la Universidad Estatal de San Diego y actualmente es profesora asistente del Departamento de Ecosistemas y Medio Ambiente de la Facultad de Agronomía e Ingeniería Forestal, donde trabaja en temas relacionados con la sustentabilidad del paisaje y la protección, restauración y manejo sustentable de riberas y ríos. Por otra parte, el profesor Cristian Escabreaza es ingeniero civil, profesor del Departamento de Hidráulica y Ambiental de la Universidad Católica, con su máster en Georgia Tech y su doctorado en la Universidad de Minnesota. El profesor Escabreaza trabaja en temáticas de mecánica de fluido, modelación en ingeniería hidráulica, transporte de sedimentos, turbulencia y últimamente en energías marinas. Así que les voy a dar la palabra a ustedes para que lideren esta conversación con Ellen y les agradezco mucho su participación y el estar con nosotros hoy. Adelante entonces, Isabel y Cristian.
Isabel, hola, ¿qué tal? No sé si quieres partir tú. Yo creo que también voy a cambiar a inglés ahora pronto porque hay algunos comentarios ahí que podemos comenzar.
Excelente, gracias Jorge, gracias Helen por la charla, estuvo fascinante, muy interesante. Y hay algunas preguntas bien interesantes del público que vamos acá a traducir también porque están en inglés, pero las vamos a traducir para toda la audiencia. Creo que voy a partir con la primera, ¿te parece, Cristian?
Me parece muy bien.
O más bien voy a partir con la segunda, que es un poquito más relacionado a mi tema, que tiene que ver también con especies invasoras. Así que primero, bueno, la pregunta es, la voy a leer en español, ¿cierto? ¿Cuál es la opinión de Helen sobre las especies invasoras que están habitando las riberas, como por ejemplo los sauces, los willows, ¿cierto? Del género Salix. Porque, por ejemplo, ¿cierto? Tienen un alta consumo de agua y dado que estamos pasando por un periodo de alta demanda de agua y también escasez, ¿cierto? De agua, puede ser un problema y obviamente está asociado también a cómo funcionan estos corredores ribereños que nos comentaba Helen. Bueno, voy a leer, quizás contar un poquito a Helen. Helen, we have like in couple of rivers, couple of watersheds in Chile, we have big problems because of invasion from different plants, like including willows, which are not native to our landscapes. And we also have acacia or
Acacia.
I don't know, acacia, invasive acacia in the rivers, and these are big concerns for people. And so we want to hear from you what you think about this.
Yeah, and I can actually see that question in English. So I can't resist. What is your opinion of species considered as invasive like willows? That's my opinion. I mean, we have different invasive species in the United States, but we have just as severe problems. Ours tend to come from Asia and Europe. I guess there's a couple things. One, it's almost impossible to eradicate invasive species. We have spent, just using the United States as an example, huge amounts of money and effort to eradicate tamarisk, which is native to Eurasia, and we can't eradicate it. They're invasive because they're very adaptable, resilient species. So, you know, I don't know if you use this expression in Chile, the can of worms. You may create more problems than you're trying to solve, but it's a can of worms to use biological control, but that sometimes can work if it's very carefully done. If you can find something that preys on your invasive species and no native species, that can help. The other thing I guess I'd have to say is sometimes the invasive species aren't as bad as we initially think. So I'll use tamarisk as an example in the southwestern US. The United States government in the late 1980s literally declared a war on tamarisk. I mean, they did herbicide, aerial spraying, they did everything they could to get rid of it. They didn't get rid of it. They did reduce the extent. But when they started studying evapotranspirative, or let's say transpiration losses, the tamarisk didn't lose that much more water than the native species like willows and cottonwood. And it turned out that some of the bird species that were of concern actually seem to do just fine living in riparian vegetation that's tamarisk. I'm not saying that all riparian vegetation that's invasive may not turn out to be as bad as you think, but I am saying that, one, it's almost impossible to eradicate. So you have to, you being at the national level, you have to strike some balance between what you can do to limit it and what you're just going to have to live with. And then maybe paying attention to, is it truly as bad as you think in terms of, say, limiting biodiversity or creating more transpiration? So that's a long, involved response that has no definitive answers, but that's a really difficult problem. When I see global evaluations by ecologists, and I, of course, am a geologist, but I see ecologists, they always rank invasive species as one of the worst things that can happen to any ecosystem, invasive exotics. So it's a problem around the world. Do you want me to address the other two that I can see here that are in English?
Yeah, maybe that's a good idea. And we also have a new one.
Okay. So the first one is beyond habitat consequences, what are possible flood consequences for implementing intensively protected structures against floods in many parts of a watershed? I think that's shown pretty clearly by the relative expenditures on flood control, so things like levees and dams, versus the amount that's lost every year certainly in industrialized countries in flood damage. We spend more to limit floods, and we still have more flood damage and loss of life. And it's partly, of course, because the infrastructure in the river corridor continues to increase. We build more stuff in the river corridor, and we have more and more people in the world every year. But it's pretty clear that we are losing the battle. So where it's possible, I mean, if you're if you're worried about overbank flooding or bank erosion in the middle of Santiago, a big urban area, you have to use pretty intensive engineering. But if you have some flexibility or latitude, by far the most effective is to put low value things like agricultural lands or recreational areas in the floodplain, not high value or high population densities. So I guess, Cesar, your original question, I'm not very impressed with the effectiveness of traditional hard engineering flood protection practices. And you asked beyond habitat consequences. Another big one would be eutrophication in river corridors and nearshore zones. So we have dead zones in the nearshore area of many large rivers in the industrialized world. That's partly because we just shunt everything downstream. So not just floodwaters, but all the excess nutrients in there, rather than having it spread across a floodplain and be biologically reduced through microbial communities, riparian vegetation. So I think we have, beyond just the obvious of flood damage, we have a lot of secondary effects that are unfortunate consequences of things like levees and flow regulation. And your second question was, could it be worse to interfere with the evolutionary dynamics of a river? Well, that's what we've mostly been doing, is interfering. So I guess what I'm advocating for is trying to step back and reduce the level and the intensity of our interference. Christian, do you want me to just keep going with they're all in English? So
yeah, maybe that's a good idea. I've also received a couple of questions by other means, internal secret means. So you can go ahead and we can talk about that later.
Okay, so the next one is, given geological timescales, how much time would it take the Rhine River, for example, that's the river in Italy, to roll back to its natural regime? Would it take a single considerable flood event or multiple flood events? I qualified by saying it's never going to go back to a completely natural regime. They restored a limited length of that river and they did not completely reconnect the floodplain. But how long it takes to sort of renaturalize the restored part, I think depends a lot on how hydrologically variable the system is. So what I'm thinking is, if you're in an arid region, you've got greater hydrologic variability and you might have to wait until an extreme flood before there's a lot of adjustment. in a place that's dominated by an annual snowmelt peak flow, it could just be a few years. It's a good question, Vicente, but it's very difficult to answer because I think it's very context dependent. The next one from Hernan, given the extensive drought that affects central Chile, what is the importance of ephemeral rivers? And do you think that these are more sensitive to the changes in hydrology due to climate change? I personally am a fan of ephemeral rivers. I think we underestimate their importance. They're not just dead when there's no flow in them. There have been studies that show that they do still provide ecosystem services when they're dry and when there's surface flow. So I think globally, and I would certainly include the desert areas in the US, we abuse ephemeral rivers and they are important ecosystems. Do I think they're more sensitive to the changes in hydrology due to climate change? That I don't know. A lot of ephemeral rivers are very dependent on subsurface water levels. I guess you could say they're more sensitive to climate change in the sense that they're right at the margin of survival for many organisms. So if they dry out, you're going to lose probably a lot of the biota in those river corridors. And biota here can be everything from large tree species to microbial communities. So I think I'm talking myself into the idea that maybe they are more sensitive to climate change hydrology. And yeah, the second part of that is especially considering the decrease in the frequency of floods. Yes, floods are very important for recharging the water table in those channels and floodplains. So if you lose the floods in that recharge, yeah, there could become more like upland xeric environments. Christian, just tell me when you want to stop and go to the other questions.
Yeah, no, I think that there are some interesting questions. Maybe the point that Tanya raised also in the comments is something that I was thinking, and I received another a couple of questions, which is actually the way of considering the broadly anthropogenic activities or the human dimension, as she mentions. I don't know if you wanna talk about that too.
The one thing I would say, so for those of you listening to the seminar, the organizers and I were joking a little bit about COVID before we started, or I was joking about it. And I'm going to return to COVID here because how is it possible to change the perception of people? I don't know what the situation is in Chile, but in the United States, we have a significant proportion, like 30% or more of the population that does not trust the medical science, absolutely refuses to believe that vaccines are either necessary or helpful or safe. And every medical specialist has been talking and talking and talking for almost 2 years now, saying, this is safe, do this, it helps. People, I mean, you could think about cigarette smoking, about climate change, about COVID, whatever you want. People are not willing to just accept what an expert says. Not all people are. So one of the things I've come to think is that it's really important to work with social scientists who are good at understanding how to communicate with people. We can't just lecture at them and say it has to be this way as scientists, because a certain proportion of the population will never accept that. So I think it is possible to change the perception, but we have to work with people who are not river scientists and engineers, listen to their viewpoints, be receptive to different ways of thinking about things, and work with our scholarly colleagues who know more about how people think. So I think social scientists are key. Since I'm talking to
that connects to the point that I wanted to make. Professor Wohl has written not only some of my favorite papers, but a lot of books that we also use in our courses here in the department. But you've also spent a lot of time writing books for more general audiences, doing outreach, and I would like to know more about your vision about that. In general, when we do outreach, we also hope to connect with people. And actually, Jorge was telling me that when you think about science outreach, typically is astronomy or but not generally rivers or aquatic environments or nature. So what is your view about that, and how you connect with younger audiences, K-12 or children, things like that?
I think part of it is to figure out what it is that people care about. So Isabel will probably like this. People care about living organisms more than they care about water and sediment. But they do care about the things they can do in rivers or the things they can gain from rivers. So whether it's fishing or watching birds or drinking clean water, they care about those things. So in the northwestern region of the US, I think there's 2 decades of being extraordinarily successful in getting people to appreciate natural rivers because everybody there loves salmon, the very large charismatic fish. And if you can connect the health of the salmon to the health of the watershed, then people really start to care about the watershed. So if they're concerned about the drinking water quality or their ability to swim in the stream or fish, whatever it is, figure out what they care about. And the other thing I was thinking of, since I'm talking to an audience in Chile, I don't know if it had the same title in Spanish. In English, the movie was called Yes. It was about the advertising campaign during, I think it was Pinochet's run to be reelected. The public opinion was going in the direction that Pinochet was going to be retained because they knew what to expect from him. And the other side, instead of saying, oh, look how terrible Pinochet is, started saying, but look how good life could be if we change things. So I think having a positive message rather than saying, oh, the water's polluted, we're losing all our fish, everything's terrible. It's like, look how wonderful these rivers could be and what an asset and a benefit. And that's something that's catching on in cities in the US. Instead of treating the river as a waste disposal site, it's like, oh, this could be an urban amenity. We can have cafes and walkways and even people rowing small watercraft in the river if the water is clean enough that they're not worried about getting some nasty disease if they touch the water. So presenting the benefits that can come from healthy rivers, I think, is part of it. And again, figuring out what people care about and focusing on that.
Can I make a follow-up question to those ideas? I think we don't have other questions pending. So yeah, I was wondering about another challenge also related with communication, which and that's regard more of the communication among different disciplines and experts, because one of the challenges we have in Chile for river ecology or the protecting the riparian corridors is that we have regulations or different kind of governmental institutions that are in charge of actually helping people to, I guess, reduce risk from flooding or floods, and that sometimes even like having problem with wood coming into their houses because they live too close to the river. So what they do is actually clean all the riparian soil so there is no wood. And then that's also one of the, what I think, a big trigger for invasive of the willow. So we are cleaning the river, we are making perfect habitat for the willow to come back, but we destroy the natural riparian vegetation. So besides this challenge of maybe educating more like a general public or citizens in general, we also have challenges of kind of communicating across disciplines to realize what is really what we need to do with the river, with managing rivers and the riparian zone in general. So if you have any advice or suggestions, I'd love to hear that.
That's an international problem. It's always difficult to communicate with people in different disciplines. I mean, you often have different words for the same things and you have different conceptual frameworks. But one thing that I've seen is that what should I say, I'll just call them political regulations, can be a major limitation. So a lot of the education and outreach and working with has to be at the regulatory level. In the United States, we have something called FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, that says if you have a big flood and you are going to do river restoration, you cannot increase the level of the flood that occurs on average once every 100 years. And that can really limit what you're going to do, especially the way people interpret what might increase that flood level, like adding wood into a river corridor. So I don't have any magic bullets for you. It's a difficult challenge, but it's key.
And Ellen, because we were, it was very interesting the point that you made regarding the heterogeneity, and there's a lot of uncertainty and how much we need, right? So, well, how do you think we can define objectives for restoration, or what should we look up first, especially in Chile that it's in its infancy, to think about, you know, recovering some fluvial environments and to be able to communicate this idea that connecting with these rivers can be much better, and improving them can be better for society in general.
Well, I think again the key is it's not either or. It's not going to be homogeneous or completely heterogeneous. It's a continuum. Yeah. So I think the two controls would be, what are the biggest problems? You know, why are you undertaking restoration? Is it because you can't support fish in this river, or is it because you've got horrible nitrate pollution, or whatever it may be? And then what kind of freedom or how much accommodation space do you have to create heterogeneity? So I'll use an example from the Netherlands. They've got this program called Room for Rivers. And, you know, if you can see my hands, maybe let's get them in the camera here. Maybe the historic floodplain was this wide. The contemporary floodplain is this wide. So if you can create a little inset floodplain that's that wide, you're not going back to pristine conditions, but you're creating more heterogeneity. Or if you have a completely urban channel that's just like a runway that's just smooth and straight, can you put in some boulders or some artificial bed forms, even if they're fixed in place, to create a little heterogeneity? So thinking about what latitude you've got based on the constraints at the site and what the most important problems are. And of course, the problems will dictate what kind of heterogeneity you need. If you have a horrible nitrate problem, maybe trying to establish riparian buffers that will absorb some of the nitrate coming in, as well as increasing hyperetic exchange to create denitrification in the channel. So it's a question that I can't give specific answers to, because again, it's very context dependent. But I guess that for a lot of these things, it comes down to thinking about the reach that you're most interested in the context of a larger watershed and river network, in terms of thinking about both constraints and problems and potential solutions.
Helen, we do have one more question from Gonzalo Jimenez. I don't know, it is in English too. Would you like to read it directly from the script?
Yeah, I think I have to scroll up. There it is. Okay. What do you think about sediment extraction from rivers? Is that an activity we should allow with proper management, or avoid it at all costs, considering its importance for rivers and ecosystems? Yeah, no. I visited a colleague, Luca Mau, who used to be at Pontifica, it was probably 6 years ago, and it was kind of, we call it aggregate mining in the US, and it's completely illegal in streams now. You can sometimes do it in floodplains, but yeah, it creates so many problems. I really think avoiding it at all costs in the active river corridor. You know, there are terraces that are higher above the active floodplain, or even the floodplain is a little less damaging than the channel, but not. Okay, and I'm just thinking it's also a function of scale. I really can't remember the name of the river that I saw. It was
the Maipo River, probably.
Yes, it was the Maipo. Yeah. That's huge scale.
In fact, Luca and I worked on that with a former student, and we realized that in some points since 1980, we've had incisions of 20 meters due to gravel mining, which is, a big damage.
Extreme. So if you had to do gravel mining in the active channel, if you could do it on a small scale, if you had a lot of bedload movement, that might be okay, but it's better to go outside the channel in something like terraces if you have to do it.
There's another question now at the end by Anne.
Okay. Let me scroll down. Positive communication is key to change social perception. However, when existing conflicts have surpassed the possibility of communication, we should know that we are not prepared to address this. Yes. I mean, unfortunately, I feel like that's where we're at to return to COVID again in the US. There are people who are not vaccinated who I think will die before they would get vaccinated. That's a terrible thing to say, but I just, when you get so entrenched.
And I think that the point that you make, that it's important to work with communities and even with the stakeholders when you realize that damages like, gravel mining and stuff like that endanger not only the river and the ecosystem and the connectivity, but also the infrastructure, our resilience, to withstand floods and stuff like that. It's important to make these connections between science and management and being able to work together.
And maybe one way to keep from getting so entrenched is to, again, present positive alternatives of look how nice and how beneficial and useful and et cetera this river corridor could be if we just did a few things differently. Yeah. It takes time and patience.
Yeah. Thank you.
I like the one comment from Alexis, the don't look up scenario. I've heard about that movie. I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, I haven't seen it yet either.
Yeah, that's a good analogy to this situation. And we've been working with interacting and talking with farmers here in the Tolten watershed. And there is a kind of widespread view of that the river needs to be cleaned up, and also the problem that they want to that they get floods every once in a while, and that's a problem for the productivity of the farmland. But at the same time, they do recognize the benefits that the rivers provide to them, like water resources and also recreation, etc. So I wonder if there are experiences of how to maybe, I mean, it seems that these people are willing to things, but I wonder if you have a suggestion on how to start that conversation and what kind of activities or what things have you seen that have been effective to actually maybe start with small changes, but that maybe can lead to bigger and important changes in the long term.
Well, one of the things that I've seen is that when there's a disaster and there's, say, a very large flood that creates a lot of property damage, people may be more willing to move. They've just lost everything, and there's many people have the attitude, and I understand it, that I'm going to overcome this. I'm going to be persistent and work hard and rebuild everything. But they're often more open to considering moving elsewhere. So I can think of examples in the United States where both the federal government and private environmental organizations will acquire the land and return it to more natural floodplain conditions, even if they're still farming there. There's the understanding that you may lose a year's crops because there's overbank flooding, but you remove structures like housing, for example, from the floodplain. So that's one way. The other is having a type of compensation program. And again, I can think of a couple of examples in the US where they've proposed, if you do not plant this field this year, if you allow it to be a more natural wetland, you will get mitigation credits for denitrification or for carbon storage. That does take it requires the existence of an entity, whether it's a national government or a private entity, that has the funding and the ability to do that. But that's one way to approach it. Do you want me to answer? There's one that just came up about dams.
Yeah, the two questions by Gonzalo, yeah.
So in Chile, we're still building dams. How feasible is it to reproduce future morphological and biotic changes that may be caused by altering the flow or sediment regime? And how many years should this prediction consider to predict morphological changes? Oh, yeah. We're still building dams is unfortunate. I mean, there's so much time and energy and money being devoted in the Northern Hemisphere to undoing the negative aspects of dams. I think if you can, depending on what the dam is for, if it's for hydroelectric power generation, that's often a hard thing to replace because people view it as clean energy. It's not as clean as they think, but it doesn't create the air pollution of burning coal-fired plants. If it's for water storage, again, in arid regions, that may be perceived as critical. Using some of the emerging technology. So for example, in Europe, they use something they call microhydro. Instead of building a dam across the main stem, they will excavate an artificial secondary channel and put smaller hydroelectric plants in there so that you maintain longitudinal connectivity for example, fish and for sediment movement on the main stem. Where that's not feasible, there's an awful lot of attention in both Europe and Asia to trying to learn how to bypass sediment, because of course you also have sediment accumulation in the reservoir and sediment starvation downstream. And the short version of that is I haven't seen that they haven't figured out how to do it. If you build a bypass tunnel, you have to keep the sediment moving, and if you keep the sediment moving, it beats the heck out of the bypass tunnel. It just destroys the lining, whether it's concrete or steel. So anything you can do to keep dams from being built is far better. We're so limited in mitigating the negative impacts. If it's an older dam, you can change how it's operated and try and get a slightly more natural flow regime. Hydroelectric, for example, they often turn on the flow and then they turn off the flow, and that creates havoc downstream. So having a more nuanced flow release system. But obviously I'm very biased because I'm a river scientist, but I think dams are just bad news, and it's very, not being facetious now, it's extraordinarily difficult to mitigate the negative impacts. That's what we spend a lot of time doing in the Northern Hemisphere. How long might morphological changes take? Again, that depends a lot on the system. If it's a sandbed alluvial channel, it will change more rapidly than if you're talking about a bedrock canyon. But in both cases, you will see change within a matter of years to decades. And the reversal can be faster if you take the dam out, but you have to take the dam out.
Yeah. I received just an internal question that I would like to ask. At the college level, how do you see river science progressing from earth sciences, from engineering? Do you see Bachelor of Science programs in fluvial geomorphology, or how do you see what's your vision and how this education should go?
I definitely think it's important to have interdisciplinary exposure, but I certainly can't quite imagine a bachelor's in fluvial geomorphology. I can imagine a master's with that focus. I have a lot of students who do that, but I use my own university as an example. Water has been one of the areas of emphasis since it was founded. So part of the reason I like being here is that my graduate students, master's students, for example, take courses in civil engineering. They take courses in watershed science. They take courses in riparian ecology and stream biology. So we do try to give them an integrative background, but fundamentally, there's an expression in English, jack of all trades and master of none. If you're too broad, you won't have the depth of understanding of any particular process. I still, maybe I'm just a product of a disciplinary education, but I see the advantages in having a deep understanding in one area, but being able to appreciate and understand and know something about related disciplines. In the case of river science, for me as a geologist, being able to understand the framework of engineers and ecologists and talk to them. And a lot of my research is collaborative with my colleagues from those disciplines. So I think interdisciplinary education and research and management has been an emphasis for a few decades now. I don't see that changing, but I do see the value of keeping a solid disciplinary grounding, whatever your discipline may be.
Excellent. I don't know, Isabel, if you have another comment or question.
No, I mean,
Sure.
mostly just thank you, Helen, for this very fascinating topic, and thank you to the audience. I think we're gonna have Jorge to wrap up a little bit the conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, Ellen. It's very nice to see you. It was a fantastic talk. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I just say thank you to the audience. These have been very good questions, very challenging questions.
Yes, I agree with you, and I think that this is a hot topic right now, not only at the academic level, but in the general public. Environmental conflicts and climate change, the drought. I think it's a good moment to talk about this and to take actions beyond just talking about it. But anyway, we want to thank you, Ellen, for being with us today. We really appreciate that. We know that you're pretty busy. So thank you very much. Thank you also to Cristiana and Isabel, who were in charge of the session and question and answer session. Great to have you guys here with us. Y también agradecer al público por haber asistido al seminario. Les recordamos que este seminario queda grabado en la página, en el YouTube, donde se está viendo ahora. de manera que le pueden comentar a gente que esté interesada, en caso que lo quiera ver. Y vamos a estar tratando de organizar un nuevo seminario a la vuelta en el próximo semestre académico, así que los vamos a mantener informados para que puedan unirse y aprender de alguien más que esté en alguna parte de este mundo trabajando en temas de agua y medio ambiente. Así que muchísimas gracias, que estén muy bien y un saludo. Hasta luego.
And I have to say, I look forward to eventually returning to Chile and enjoying asados and pisco sours.
You're invited, Ellen.